This is your host James, and I'm delighted to have my good friend Gerald or Clark, returning guest. Today we're going to talk again about the Anunnaki of Nibiru. Of course, Gerald is the author of the Anunnaki of Nibiru, mankind's forgotten creators, enslavers, destroyers, saviors, and hidden architects of the New World Order. And he's also got the latest book, The Seventh Planet, Mercury Rising, just recently been released, and we're going to get into some of that today. This is a follow-up show, and if you want to check out the other shows, you can obviously go for the archives at capricornradio.com. Without further ado, let's bring on today's guest. Hi, Gerald. Welcome back to the show.
Hi, James. It's really great to be back here with my Irish brother. I'm really excited about the show and the commitment we've made to each other about how we're going to share this information.
Well, I'm glad we're doing this, Gerald, because we have quite a lot of different concepts. I mean, we got a lot of history there. We got a lot of Sumerian accounts to go through. We got a lot of philosophy there. We got some spirituality and consciousness to bring into all this. And I guess I wanted to pick it up from where we were last time, Gerald. And we're going to talk about the tools versus slaves theory. These biological entities that were created on this beautiful planet Earth for the workers, for the Anunnaki. And we're going to talk about why not create tools instead of slaves, and why the slave theory, or why the tools versus slaves. But inevitably, this is going to, when we get through some of this data today, we're going to probably bring it back to consciousness, because this is the most important. This is why we're talking today, Gerald. This is why we're trying to raise people's awareness of all this. So maybe we'll get into some of that. The big question of all, Gerald, is the Anunnaki. They come to planet Earth. They have this gold mining operation, like we discussed in the last episode, and of course they create these the workers. People. I actually had this conversation last week, Gerald, and this is kind of maybe just lead us straight into it today.
Go ahead.
People were, philosophizing with me, and they're like, well, why would you create a biological entity? Why would you go to that such level? And I was like, well, number one, because you could, and number two, because you're genetically advanced, and number three, it's better than tools. And they just couldn't understand. And this is coming from an engineer, Gerald, that it is a better operation than tools.
Yeah, well, I mentioned this in the book, and I think this was one of the neatest parts I wrote, was wrestling with the idea why an advanced race wouldn't come prepared to use the tools if that's the resource they were after. And I think part of it was a miscalculation on their part in thinking that they could get the gold from the oceans that probably required different mining tools than it did if you had to go dig ore out of the ground. So part of it was I don't think they came prepared to actually do the kind of mining they ended up having to do. But I went through a scenario with folks. And
sure.
Postulated a project that I had been working on when I was doing evolvable hardware. And that was, imagine, let's look at what goes on Mars right now. So imagine you build a rover and you give it all these sensors and effectors so that it can go pretend to be a human on another planet that, the oxygen level and such, the radiation level doesn't really support a biological being to be there. But if you could put a biological being there and not deal with the remote telemetry problems of sending a signal to the thing, possibly not getting it, maybe having a problem with the communications module, possibly having something happen to one of the electronics modules that is part of charging the batteries, and all of a sudden, you've got a robotic, unmanned autonomous vehicle that's got a limited life, and it's gonna die. So there's all these problems, windstorms, weather, obscuration of the lenses, effectors not working right so it could pick up the little rock. Now think about what it's trying to do and replicate the behaviors of a human. If you could put a human in a suit and overcome the environmental constraints and put them in the same capacity, functioning as this unmanned autonomous rover, well, a meat entity that's in communications with the host that sent them there would be far more effective, especially if they didn't have communication problems and all those things. And if you're in full communication, you know what your mission is. Get this, look at that, dig some of this up, put it, you can get it done much better than you can with a machine. So that said, there's other reasons to look at what the Anunnaki did relative to this issue. Okay.
Sure.
And actually, before I finish the Mars thing, I wanted to put one more piece in there. So now imagine that you had to train this Martian rover with a rule set to allow it to overcome its environment, all the unanticipated things that it's going to see, and try to capture that, a rule set, so that you could keep your information gathering telemetry robot alive. Well, it's near impossible to anticipate every possible environmental circumstance and permutations that can occur. And I gave one of those in the book, recognizing danger, for instance. Humans do this at an intuitive level, whereas a machine may see something and never make the inference that, hey, that's dangerous for me, unless it got captured in a rule set by one of the programmers that set it up. So because of that problem, it had me focused in my graduate research. How do you take all these disparate inputs that we use to create sensor fusion, an awareness of what's happening in your environment, to assess what out there is interesting and or dangerous or helpful? So and we went into the book, and we're going to get to there later, defining the term interesting. I kind of gave away a little clue, but not the generic term of the definition. So comparing, contrasting a machine operating as an unmanned autonomous vehicle performing telemetry and possibly data gathering on another planet is really instructive to compare what the Anunnaki had to face here on Earth. So now all of a sudden they originally show up around 450,000 years ago with about 50 workers in the Persian Gulf, migrate to Africa with Enki, and all of a sudden they don't have any major tools to do mining, and they're confronted with a big problem. These people, actually I went back and read the Ultra-Hasis account. It was after only one Shar they got upset. So that's only 3,600 years. Okay. Wow. Anyway, so they revolted. Well, at that point they were faced with this meat versus tool decision. And you realize that they already came prepared with meat hosts that were their workers that were doing this for them. So they already had made a statement about their propensity to use biological entities versus machines. Now, did they have advanced mining tools that these biological entities got to use and didn't get to disclose to humanity? Very possibly. Okay. Mm. We've seen everything from rock vitrification to unbelievable underground spaces that have been built. And you have to ask yourself, well, did they not have anything but a copper chisel? That's hard to believe. Okay. So basically what I'm saying is when Enki and Anu and Enlil and I believe Belet Ili or Nin Hartzog were at the council meeting to decide about these primitive slaves that they were about to create, they certainly understood the trade-off between meat and machine. And let's look at some other kind of hard facts relative to meat. Number one, if they were designed so that they were communicated with bidirectionally through the electromagnetic spectrum, which they would have done, it explains a lot about the human antenna theory that I brought up in the Annunaki and Nibiru, how it is that our meat is sensitive to the electromagnetic spectrum in both receiving and sending signals to communicate with them. And this brought up the idea of, that never changed, and the fact that you're a meat modem communicating continuously, whether you're transmitting and they're receiving and communicating or not, you're always transmitting. So you're still a telemetry meat modem. And they're still using you. Okay. So let's go back to the mind. So now all of a sudden they're faced with, well, should we create meat or a machine? Well, it seemed like they chose biological entities. And there's another reason for that. Let's think about if you've got an advanced piece of machinery that's being used hard in mining for a very long time, it's going to require maintenance. It's going to require substitute parts. And unless you're coming here to set up an assembly line to be able to produce this and keep this operation in continuous functioning, that's a pretty big jump from where they started thinking they were going to get colloidal solution from the ocean to full on dealing with a South African mine. Major processing. Mining is a difficult task. Anyway, so at that point they're like, well, why have a factory to produce parts when you've got replicatable, easily reproduced biological entities that if you could have enough of them, they can meet your labor requirement. And they seem to operate that way. And also they're, you don't need a factory to support them, and they're self-replicating, and actually they're quite replaceable. Gerald, and that's hard to say, but the reality is it's true.
Gerald, I in my mechanical engineering days in university, we actually did robotics. It's not what I specialized in, but we had to do a robotics module. And we had to program a very basic robot to go and do something. And the amount of lexicon and programs and language that you have to tell that machine to go and do something like pick up a pencil even. You know, it's like there's so much programming and control and everything to get it right just to do a simple task. I mean, self-replicate.
Right. Well, essentially what you're stumbling onto is how do you teach the intuitive awareness, the sensor-fused reality that a human is able to do to a machine, a computer. How do you teach it to look at the environment and go, that's interesting or that's not? I mean, if you look at all the objects in a simulator, even the game simulators, if you had to divide your attention among all of them simultaneously, it's impossible. Well, our world is the same way. And our body is the same way too, in that we seem to have this ability to focus based on a prioritization that's endemic in our biological design. And this goes back to some research I was doing. And a company I worked for that was named after this organ was reticular systems. So it was named after the reticular activating system, which is a primitive part of the pons in your brainstem that basically controls your awareness. And so, you ask yourself as you're going through the simulator out there going, well, why am I interested in that? And why am I not interested in that? Well, what drives your focus of attention to interest is part of this primitive construct of your reticular activating system. Okay. Oh. So, I guess while we're talking about meat, did we finish on tools versus slaves? Do you think we put a nail in that one? Because I think we did.
I think we did.
Because clearly that's what they did. And so when it came time to replace the Ujiji rebels, who were meat servants, and they were very advanced ones too, not subservient beings that didn't understand what was going on. They were called fellow gods. So when they got replaced by another meat entity to do the same function, that's where we show up on the scene in all the genetic studies and the location in Southeast Africa with the gold mines, the stories from the Sumerians talking about that's what they did. It all fits. And, for a scientist like me and like you, when you read something like that and there's corroborative evidence that can't be hand waved away, it's hard to walk away from.
I think the big thing is, Gerald, this keeps coming back to genetics. This keeps coming back to biological engineering, highly sophisticated, and like I say, that explains not just the biological robots, these meat slaves that were here doing the mining, but it also explains this longevity of the Sumerian gods.
Mm-hmm. Right. Actually, one more thing I want to talk about.
It explains so many things, Gerald.
Right, it does. Before we jump off into talking more about splicing chromosomes and possibly this genetic mixing issue, there was one other thing I wanted to talk about, and that's imagine that you truly were a biological being that they designed, such that you had bidirectional communications with them. They could send you something over the electromagnetic spectrum, not over a Motorola radio attached to your head, okay? I'm talking through the electromagnetic spectrum. Very advanced understanding of that, which was clear by Enki's taking the energy out of one being and putting the other. They knew a lot about the electromagnetic spectrum. And the idea of telepathy to them was probably second nature. So for them to be able to communicate with us over the electromagnetic spectrum into our receive part of the demodulator, right? I called this a biological modem, modulator, demodulator. That's what a radio transceiver is. Well, you're really a biological transceiver or a meat modem. That's a term I'm coining. Well, imagine that something happened and you got stranded on Mars. You were in a suit where you could survive, and they were communicating with you over the electromagnetic spectrum. You're getting your mission, you're digging up rocks, you're testing the water, all the things that they want you to do. Then all of a sudden, something happens and you lose communication with them. You can transmit, you're saying, hey, danger, danger, danger. I'm running out of oxygen here. I need you guys to beam me back on the ship or whatever. Well, at that point, imagine that you were transmitting, but they weren't listening anymore.
Mm-hmm. Wow.
That's the state that most people are now in, is they're actually a bidirectional meat modem, and they're not, unless they are able to overcome the consciousness suppression that's happened in this particular zodiacal age, and it's happened before. They never actually have their receivers set to the point where they can listen anymore. So in other words, their communication's cut off, and there are these meat modems running around in the simulator with no direction. And you can see that in the world. And everybody's searching for the meaning of their life because of this, because of what happened.
In a way, they've lost their curator, Gerald.
Exactly. And so, in one of the, I think it was, I want to say it was one of the, Immortal movie, one of the, comic book, shows.
Immortal Kombat?
Well, I want to say it was Thor or one of those. But anyway, Loki was in it, okay? And he's in Germany with a bunch of people cowering around on the ground. And he shows up and says, you people are, he gets them to all bow down, right? And he goes, you people were born into slavery. You need someone like me to tell you what to do. And I thought about this, this meat modem issue and your command being stuff. And, a lot of people are operating in that way because they're lost sheep, because they've lost this connection. So they don't understand the connection back to their source. And I think this was intentional.
Okay. So Gerald, here's a big one then. Okay. Let's bring this into consciousness or compassion as well. I mean, if they created us for this purpose, were they compassionate towards us, or were they giving us a level of consciousness or awareness, or both, just enough to get us to do the task and not enough to revolt, overthrow, be aware and go, I'm not going to work anymore? I mean, there must have been a threshold there, Gerald, where they said, don't give them too much.
I think you're hitting on something really deep. And that is, and we know from Enki's teachings and also from his son Ningshita's teachings that we were endowed with a particular interface to the electromagnetic spectrum that allowed us to have the experience, the knowledge of good and evil, these levels of consciousness that they had. And this came up in the Garden of Eden when Enki told them, oh no, you won't die if you eat this plant. You'll just start waking up like we do, like we are. And this ties into the chakras and the Hindu levels of consciousness. So these quantized levels of consciousness are very interesting. If you ascribe to consciousness being energy quantized in the various levels in your chakras. Imagine you start out the lowest one. You've got the consciousness of, whatever that chakra allows before you're allowed to proceed through the next one. Well, that consciousness is very interesting in that its scope precipitates what you focus on as your awareness. So you're going to be focused on things that you're aware, only things that you can be aware of are within the realm or the envelope of the consciousness level that you're at. So as that envelope or those quantized states of energy increase in your electrical interface that Enki designed into us. Okay, 7 chakras on the 7th planet. We can see 7 wavelengths in the visible spectrum from 400 to 700 nanometers: red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, and violet. Well, it turns out those are the same wavelengths that show up in your chakras. So this is by design. So ask the question again: were we given an interface to have a communication back with the source? It looks like we were. And this was the original interface. Actually, it never changed. The question is, the issue was that people weren't aware that they had this spirit energy interface that's built into them so they can get out of this place where they're meandering, unmanned autonomous vehicles that are not being commanded anymore. And I know I'm making some weird analogies, but I hope people understand.
Well, ironically, I mean, look at how much people are programmed today in a hypnotic sense. When you're talking about being programmed by electromagnetic energy, I mean, look at people who look at logos. You want to talk about all the big advertising companies like Coca-Cola, McDonald's, exactly. All their icons, secret societies or whatever group or, situation on this planet, everybody uses some sort of a symbol or symbolism, to program the mind, Gerald.
Well, remember also though, there's good and bad operating simultaneously. Okay, don't forget that. There were benevolent forces on the Enki side that used us as primitive workers. He wrestled with the idea of doing that over our fate and destiny and how it impacted our evolution, giving us a jump start versus enslaving us. And ultimately, I believe he felt like his intentions were pure. He was trying to help out the team accomplish a very difficult mission. And in retrospect, in some of his writings, and I do believe he felt like he did the wrong thing. And I think based on that, knowing that we are his creation, not to leave out who he venerated was the creator of all. And I want to make sure people hear that. The Anunnaki may have been geneticists, but they weren't ultimately the creators of the seeds of life. They clearly told us that the creator of the seeds of life, of all life, came from the creator of all. And later when we get into chapter 5, you're going to see what those design rules were that they actually disclosed to us. Mm-hmm. And this has been the secret knowledge inside the secret societies for a very long time. And so the idea that we're going to be exposing that to the lay public of all the secret mysteries that go through all time. This is not some fad. This is the ultimate knowledge that came directly from our progenitors. So I was very excited to look at that as a scientist, connect all the way back to the Sumerian King's List, back into the Anunnaki, and be able to explain that. And we're going to get there, and I know. So we're going to probably talk a little bit more about how once we went from meat slaves to this particular issue where the second person of the geneticist showed up. Mm-hmm. And remember, I may have mentioned it or may not, but for us farm folks that know about these kind of things, if you take a male horse and a female jack and you breed them, you'll end up with a mule, and it's impotent. Well, lots of animals that interbreed across their class or their category end up with offspring that can't procreate. I give you the liger, for instance, the lion and the tiger. Yeah. They breed, it produces this massive offspring, but it's impotent. Well, the same thing, I believe, happened with Enki and the being that he chose to mix his genetic material with in the steppes of Africa, where they clearly were watching all the bipedal hominids that were down in that same area where they're doing the mining. You know, they had to be aware of all of them. Everything from Cro-Magnon, Neanderthal, the Denisovian findings that 400,000 years ago that kind of overlaps when the Anunnaki were here. So there were several bipedal hominids out there that he was aware of. So the idea of mixing his DNA with one of them, hoping to produce an offspring that could fill their labor requirements in the mines, you know, it was kind of urgent. They've had a revolt. They waited too long. They waited till it became important and urgent. They didn't listen to Stephen Covey and deal with it was important, but not urgent yet. Okay. They should have acted sooner.
Sure.
But when they did that, they also all of a sudden ran into this problem where all of a sudden, you know, maybe it was by design that they knew it couldn't procreate. But that's when the analysis of the DNA took place by Enki's son. Now, at this point, I believe Enki was the carrier of the caduceus. I want to clear that up. This is the two serpents around a central pole with the wings and a knob on the top. Yeah. And it's used in the American Medical Association and in Britain as well, representative of health.
So iconic.
That was Enki's symbol, which was commented on by Enlil in the Garden of Eden, where he called him the evil snake. Well, yeah, there were snakes going around the pole, but they represented the double helix of your DNA. So, well, something important relative to that symbol, and I've been all about that symbol for a long time, was it got handed off to his son, Ningshita, who was the geneticist that shows up in this account. So he's the one that got to deal with the DNA that wasn't producing an offspring and went off into the lab and figured it out. Right? So I view him as the second geneticist, creator in the creation account. Yeah, there was a creator of all, created the seeds of life. Then there was Enki that came along and modified the seeds of life to create a sentient worker that could do their commands. But then Ningshita came along and made it so that they could procreate.
He's the hero of the tale, Gerald, Ningshita.
Well, you know, he doesn't get a lot of notoriety because he was the brilliant one behind the doors that did all the work. And how often do you see that in the world? People, you know, sycophantically taking someone else's work and claiming it's their own to get paid. It's disgusting. Well, this guy was full of honor and integrity, and you'll see it all through the book. Anyway, so he comes up with a splicing capability that he implemented on the second chromosome, which you can see in our genetic code today. So they had a mismatch between the number of chromosomes that are required to procreate. You know, the X and the Y had to be just right in a male and female. Well, he had to line these up, so he did. And this is evident in our DNA. So I wanted to bring that up for people who don't know about that. But Ningshita was his name. He showed up as a very funny name in the Enuma Elish, which was the Babylonian epic of creation that was read every spring in Babylon by Marduk after he changed the name of Nibiru to his own name in it. Okay, there was a previous version of that. Anyway, so Ningshita was his name, but back on the Enuma Elish, his name was Mumu. It was really funny, and I mentioned this in my book under my synchronicities. One of my kids chose his email address to be Mumu way back when he was, first getting his first email account. And I thought that was hilarious until I read the Enuma Elish and realized that Ningshita's name was Mumu, and it was referring to the planet Mercury. So his affiliation later with the Romans as Mercury was quite interesting. Of course, he was Hermes in Greek, but he became Mercury again in Rome. Mm-hmm. And then this goes back into the deep knowledge about alchemy and the first alchemist. And this all comes out in my book later. But this being, I chose him specifically because of what he did. He looked like he was benevolent to mankind, just like his father was. And the fact that he ended up getting the Caduceus given to him was symbolic of a power transfer. It always was in the Sumerian documents. You know, sometimes like the son would take over the kingship from the father. Well, not only would he get all the instruments, the crown and the tiara representing kingship, blah, 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 but he also got to absorb all the names and attributes of all the beings that were on the council below him. Really an interesting thing. So with Marduk, he did this and he was kind of such a self-promoter that he made this really obvious. So when they were reading the Enuma Elish every spring in Babylon under Marduk rule, and he was at the height of his rule, circa 2000 BCE. Okay. But they would read all 50 names because he took over the Lord of the Command Council away from Enlil. He smote Enlil somehow through his brutal warring with him and ended up in this Lord of the Air, Lord of the Earth command seat of 50. Well, he'd have the 50 names of Marduk read with the Enuma Elish. So representative of this namesake subsumption is what I call it. They would subsume all the powers of the ones that were below them, all the way up to where the rank was. So I thought that was really, really, so at the same time, thinking about that, maybe there was something to it, that they got endowed with the powers of the ones when they held this rank. So the fact that Ningshita, who became Thoth in Egypt, who became Hermes to the Greeks and Mercury to the Romans, was also the one who showed up going back and forth to Nibiru, brokering the liaison between the Adapa. And I think that shows up in the third chapter. We're probably going to talk about that. So he's a very, very important being who kind of gets left out of the story somewhat. Well, so I saw this happening, you know, being an inventor, having many patents to my name. Mm-hmm. And constantly in engineering, like you mentioned in the last show, it's a creative process, and you're constantly taking gray matter and turning it into real circuit boards and things like that. Well, you could see that the being was like that. So I guess as a scientist, I really identified with his perspective and decided to adopt it and tell this story of the seventh planet, Mercury rising, all the way through.
Sure.
So now you realize where the title came from. Part of it was from the synchronicity I mentioned in chapter 12, where the idea of Mercury rising came from. And then the first part of the title came from a clear idea about which planet this was in their cosmogony and making that available and aware to people, kind of like what Sitchin did by naming their planet the 12th planet. But we know a lot more about the 7th planet than we knew about the 12th planet. So
sure.
That's how that came to be.
With respect to Ningshita, and like I say, I think he's the hero of the tale.
Totally.
He's brought in to solve this procreation problem, okay? Do you think then, and let's explain that as well. In genetics, but he comes in to save the day, to get these biological robots, these mules, offsprings, and these, to reproduce and make sure that they keep reproducing. So he solves this problem, but do you think perhaps then that he put in this hidden essential knowledge? Was that his route into giving us
Well, I really think so. I really think so. We talked about that the last show, about these latent circuits. Listen, you know that if Enki was having issues about enslaving these beings versus allowing them to have a jump start, an evolutionary jump start, so that means they still got to achieve the consciousness that the Anunnaki achieved through this time process. And he knew that. So my question is, knowing that, did he communicate with his son and they craft a time sequenced set of circuits in your DNA such that over a period of time you became just like they were? I believe that's absolutely what they did, and we talked about those 8 circuits last time on the show. So I do believe that the master programmer, Ningshita himself, actually did that to our DNA.
Let's talk chromosomes, Gerald, on the splice second chromosome. Don't we have this weird thing on our chromosome chart?
We do, and I didn't go dig into the stuff where I had researched this, but I wrote about it at some point. There's clear evidence that our second chromosome has had some splicing, so that the number of chromosomes from the zygote, probably from this Neanderthal DNA that was used, or Cro-Magnon, whichever it was. There were lots of bipedal hominids. They probably did it to multiple. It was not just one. And, in order to line up the genetic material, the X and the Y chromosomes. So, there's clear evidence. And one of the researchers out of Hawaii, I'm trying to remember his name right now, who was a geneticist, discusses this as well. But it's pretty damning knowledge to know that this was done. So, and it's not a secret.
Does anybody does geneticists today even have any answer for that chromosome problem, that fusing?
Well, I just remembered his name. I think and I've reached out to him a couple of times. I haven't heard back from him. I think his name was William Brown out of the University of Hawaii. He was onto this story, and I think he ended up getting some darkness poured on his path because he was trying to expose it. But I think he's the one that or somebody like him who's in that space. I think it'd be wonderful. I'm not a geneticist. I'm an electrical engineer, so I can possibly, hypothetically tell you what I know about it. And I've read Signature in the Cell and several books on genetics because of my kid's condition that I mentioned, right? I was focused on genetics trying to help my kid. So
sure.
When I ran into this stuff, it kind of bolstered me at least to hopefully not speak beyond my knowledge level, but but I'm not a medically trained geneticist. I don't decode the human DNA, even though that whole genome project ended up at UCSD. Quite interesting.
Where do you think the awareness of the original people going back to ancient Sumeria, the workers, call them the workers, do you think they were just like totally inept and like, on the low level awareness scale and then...
No, actually I don't.
Do you think the starting point
you remember when Enki and Enlil were in the Garden of Eden and they're having this discussion about these labor force is going to procreate, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, when they got thrown out of the garden because they made the choice to choose consciousness over enslavement with Enlil, he got really upset. And, there's the whole story of mankind falling into sin and being thrown out of the garden. Well, the reality was Enki intercepted the Adapa, the atom. He didn't go to some, exile or something. He actually became the chief priest in the city of Eridu. He was Enki's chief priest. He taught him everything he knew, actually. He was very, very wise. So the idea that they had the capacity to take on the mental capabilities and the constructs that the Anunnaki had designed with ought to be very telling for you. The idea that intelligence keeps increasing over time with every civilization is just not the case. There's rise and falls of civilizations where whole knowledge bases get erased, where you get put back into your primitive worker state, right? Well, he was also called out, the Adapa, as the one who even knew some of the rules, the language, the key words to affect even the weather. He apparently was saying something on his fishing voyage where he interrupted the weather with this powerful knowledge he had from Enki. So much so that he got the attention of Anu and got himself hauled back to Nibiru with Dumuzi and Nagshita to explain what happened. Very, very interesting tale. So, the idea that they were primitive workers, yes, at the Garden of Eden, but at that point you realize that Enki had endowed them with the capabilities to have the intelligence, which he said, but only, the downside was only having a lifespan of 120 years. Now,
Gerald, let's pause for a moment. Think today of what we would do. Imagine we were doing this today. Forget about the Sumerian tales for a moment. Let's say we started playing with the genetics and creating people, or whether they were for enslaved or not. I mean, the morality around that and the questions and the task that you would undertake and whether it was right or wrong. And the philosophy around the whole idea of what you would do. I mean, this is basically what's happening in ancient Sumeria. I mean, Enki and Enlil, are they okay with it? Are they not okay with it? Are they feeling, sentiment about what they're actually trying to do? Are they wrestling with it? It's all there. It's all there, Gerald.
That brings us right into the modern issue with those kind of discussions. Yeah. Should we have created Dolly the sheep? Should we be cloning animals? Should we be doing genetic modifications on plants to allow more humans to assimilate and eat this stuff?
Stem cells.
All these kind of issues about right or wrong are being put right in your face, so that you as co-creators could probably make the same kind of decisions they had to wrestle with.
It's amazing that people today are oblivious that this has already happened on our planet in Sumerian tales. These guys are already wrestling with these moralities issues.
Well, now that it's happening now on the planet, I think it makes it so that it's much more believable. Because imagine 200 years ago reading this stuff. Wow, what a bunch of storytelling. Because you didn't have the consciousness. You weren't at the consciousness level, so that your awareness could find that interesting. Remember what I talked about, these sequences of consciousness. Mm-hmm. So when you get to the highest consciousness level, your awareness is going to be focused on the thing that's most interesting. And it always is. There's one after the other, things that are interesting. And it's same with the body. I want to talk about this. The reticular activating system is very telling in how it works in the body. And I used to do this with people. I'd walk up, and you can do it either verbally or do it somatically and touch them. I'd say, okay, well, you're aware of all these different thoughts and things going on in your head, but are you aware of the sensation of the wristwatch on your left wrist right now? You know, what is it? Or you, better yet, if you're close by, you just touch them in a spot where they didn't anticipate it. Well, all of a sudden you realize how the reticular activating system works. It all of a sudden makes all that external environment unimportant, and it draws your awareness to that single point of contact, because that's the thing that's interesting right then and there. And that's how the categorization of awareness works. It does it based on a prioritization process. You can't be focused on everything simultaneously. You only can be focused on the things that are most important in your environment. And this comes out as I was building this 6 Degree of Freedom simulator later that we will talk about, in how you teach a machine to focus on the environment, create sensor fusion and awareness. And the AI, it's an AI construct, okay? How to do this with machines. Well, back to this, not to get off track too much, but that's what I was trying to do, was create an automated way to not do a rule set a priori for an unmanned autonomous vehicle that could learn from its environment and do the same thing that we do. And I think this has now gotten to the place where it's much more mature. As a matter of fact, the other day I was watching this special on drone technology where this guy was on stage and he had 3 or 4 drones flying around him, and they were working as a team. The drones were communicating with each other, and they also had proximity warning devices on them so that if you got too close to them, they would back away, you know, and even from each other. So they started showing how these things could be given survival rules like a human, and it was kind of crazy to see this. So.
The thing is, you know, even this whole thing that we're discussing here, the genetics, the morality, the implications of it all, I think whether you're talking Enki, Enlil, Ninhursag, Ningshida, whoever on this Sumerian gods list, I mean, I think when you look at all their tales, I think there's intelligence in there, superior intelligence. I think there's good and bad. I think there's emotions. I think there's probably some psychopathic actions as well, Gerald. But I think inherently, just let me finish. I think inherently, I think good is going to win the day, and I think that they're going to, you know, I think their way around all this was to put this gateway to escape the enslavement. I think they said, okay, look, it might not be morally good what we're doing. Okay, we might have no choice. We're going to have our Nibiru, you know, wiped out with solar radiation or whatever's going to happen on that planet. We need this gold, and we're not going to survive anyway. Okay, they might have had some morality issue with it, but I think their only way out of it, at least maybe that's how it was sold to them, was that like, oh, let's just put a gateway in for them to escape this enslavement, and that'll just appease ourselves. I think somebody.
Well, I think that was for their future de-guiltification.
Yeah.
They knew they enslaved them. They gave them that as their little reward so that, you know, over time, when they were ready, they would wake up to the knowledge that they had.
Yeah.
Well, you know, at the same time, they had implemented a veil so that, you know, they could control what level of consciousness you were at to determine, you know, if you weren't even aware that you were enslaved, you wouldn't have any propensity to want to revolt. And remember, that was the key feature that had to be in this replacement species, us, because the Gigi revolted and they didn't want that to happen again. Why would you design a replacement that had the same propensity as the one before you? Yeah. So I think it's very clever what they did with these latent circuits of awakening. And it's clear to me that they're tied to galactic wobble cycles and energy, external energy triggers, as well as the symbolic ones that we discussed in the circuits that I find so interesting from Dr. Leary. I think it was just brilliant work. As a matter of fact, I don't even know how it got buried
you know,
so long.
I did a show actually on Timothy O'Leary, the Harvard years, before the whole LSD culture stuff. Some of his earliest work was incredibly pioneering.
Listen, I have to say, I'm kind of bad with names. Was his last name Leary or O'Leary?
No, Leary. Yeah, the original.
Leary, okay.
No,
I've been lambasted. I don't know how many times for pronouncing Edward Case with one E at the end, not saying KC, like somebody can't understand it's the same person. But okay, there you go. It's KC, one of my heroes. Okay,
for sure. Yeah, well, Timothy Leary without the O. Originally it was O'Leary. And the problem is when people leave Ireland, they used to drop the O's and they get misspellings of their names. But yeah, Timothy Leary. Some of his work, and I mean certainly around these what we talked about on the last show in terms of Leary's research. I mean, I think this is incredibly obvious once you hear his analysis. I mean, it makes so much sense of all these receptors and.
Yeah. Well, what tied it together for me was Ian Lungold and Dr. Callum's discussion of the Mayan calendar and how those were tied to these 9 rows of the evolution of consciousness that were tied to frequency. And I started to go into that on my blog, on my website, to describe what they understood. Now, and the reason the Mayans were so important to me, because Ningshita was Quetzalcoatl. Okay, for all you listening out there, the Mayan calendar came from the genius Ningshita, who gave mankind the calendar and language according to Thoth in Egypt. Okay, well, it happened in Sumeria as well, but Ningshita was the one behind the solar lunar calendar that the Mayans ended up with this advanced knowledge. So understanding his knowledge about when he set up the start date for the Mayan long count to the point where you pass through the galactic dark rift that they used. Mm-hmm. Well, this is a galactic wobble they were basing it on. So I think that's brilliant. And now you realize it's the same person who was a programmer and a scientist and a geneticist. Well, clearly he probably made a deal with his dad that said, yeah, we've got the veil on them right now, but when a couple of these cycles happen, their quantized consciousness will go from here to here to here based on these latent circuits, and they'll be awake at the same level we are. It's like a slow, iterative unfolding of what happened to you so that they can manage, the information flow back to you to let you know, yeah, we did this to you, but don't be too mad at us because look what we gave you. We gave you connection to these same light spirits that we have that allow us to be immortal beings. So when you find out that you're from that source genetically, that you have the same capabilities to live eternally they do, that's in you, and you're already an eternal spirit that's living in a meat host, it changes a lot of stuff about religion and your understanding of the world. And actually it gives you a lot of hope that you realize now there's a direct connection for all people to this energy through your latent circuits that are now, and if you look around the world, what's happening with people, and I've been watching this for years. There's a lot of people whose latent circuits are now being triggered and they're waking up.
People have
and it makes sense if you look at the Mayan calendar, the last stage on it in that telescoping cycle. And by the way, I've got to mention Ian Lungold's name. I just found out with you recently that he had passed away in 2005.
I never knew, Gerald.
He was a brilliant researcher. And I think him along with, and I don't want to leave out Dr. Kalaman. Johann Kalaman, who wrote I think it was the Mayan Cosmogenesis, but in there he describes these 9 underworld frequencies that fall into your brainwave region that it has never left me because I realized that was very important in this world within world view that we're going to end up talking about later. So Ningshita, it was at the center of that, okay? So don't lose track of that.
So this is the secret weapon that Ningshita had. He's like, okay.
Well, yeah. Exactly.
This is just for the listeners, Gerald. Let me explain it. So we're going through these galactic cycles and we're going through these precessional wobbles, and he knew this and he said, okay, I could put something in there so that when we do go through that, we're going to get this little DNA activation. And nobody's going to know about that. So I think Ningshita had this secret little plan, to put this.
This is a backdoor program.
Yeah, it's a backdoor program that Ningshita. This all makes sense there, Gerald. This makes so much sense to me.
Yeah.
But here's the thing. Okay, so Ningshita steps in. He's given the solution to procreation. He's the hero of the day to the Anunnaki hierarchy and everything else. So he's got himself.
He wasn't originally, but yeah.
Well, yeah, he was originally, but Ningshita comes in, solves the procreation problem. He's given a bit more credibility, given a bit more leeway, given a bit more control, perhaps.
He was given the caduceus.
Exactly. So in doing so
there was a power transfer there.
So in this power transfer, then he decides to slip in this, DNA activation, this upgrade going through the dark rift and what the Mayan talked about. So then we go from procreation to us having a little gateway of consciousness. He does it on the sly. Nobody knows about it. And then when they find out about it, when the hierarchy of the Anunnaki find out about it, they go crazy, Gerald, and they just try to wipe us out.
Do you think Enki and his son being around Enlil, knowing that he destroys everywhere he goes, that they knew that they were going to have to put something within them to give them a fighting chance to be on the same level, to become aware of who the destroyer is, the great deceiver, so that they could break out of that darkness that was poured on them as a veil, so they were entrapped. Think about the term enlightenment, overcoming this veil of entrapment in this simulator that we're in. So I totally think, as if Ningshita was as sophisticated as I think he was, the idea of having simulation model, the planet Key, and all the other planets in the orbit retrograde, who had what resource through their spectroscopy studies. Think high science. We're novice at science compared to a race that was doing space travel and was taking the energy out of one being and putting it into another, like a reverse exorcism. This is crazy science that they're aware of.
It's fascinating. The thing is, when you look at this, like I keep going back to this again, when you look at this story with advanced genetics in mind, it answers everything. It doesn't answer one or two problems. And from a scientific perspective. And from a scientific perspective.
Nishida was a scientist, and so was Enki. So you have to understand science to really make sense of what they were doing.
Usually I find, Gerald, okay, when you use one thing to try and solve a problem and it solves the whole problem, well then that's probably the right thing. It's probably true. And that's what
that's Occam's razor. Right. The simplest answer is usually the right one.
When you can find one simple answer that explains everything, well then it's not fanciful, it's not mythology. There you go. No. How you press it, you either accept it or you don't.
Well, I think that's why the field of genetics has been such a guarded area, is that, the truth is in our DNA. And ultimately, you remember Zecharia Sitchin in one of his interviews I was watching, and I mentioned this on a radio program. His dying wish was that somebody, a geneticist, would take apart the DNA of one of these Sumerian bodies that they found and prove his theory was true once and for all while he was still alive. And, we have the capability to do that right now. We found Gilgamesh's grave, okay? We have disclosures from the University of Pennsylvania that they've got some old Sumerian bodies in their archives they didn't even know they had that they can get DNA from. So that, the truth is inches away from it being disclosed. And the reality is, just from what we've been able to dig into, it's almost irrefutable. The Sumerians knew this, and they didn't have a problem with it. They knew they were created by the Anunnaki to serve them, and they did it willingly.
Gerald, I'm glad you mentioned Gilgamesh's body there. I actually discussed that a long time ago. Do you think the American military went in? This is right wing now, this one. Do you think the American military went in to get the body of Gilgamesh specifically?
Well, I think there was a lot of storytelling about what the motivations were to go into the cradle of civilization in southern Iraq. Now remember how the country got divided almost north and south from Basra, south of the first incursion in 1991. By the way, I have to disclose something.
Sure.
When I left the military in 1989, I turned down receiving an Apache helicopter and becoming an instructor pilot, and then going off to Germany, one of the places I really loved, because I'd been over there twice under the Reforger mission, where we took our whole battalion and went to Germany to simulate, people coming through the Fulda Gap in tanks and overrunning Europe, like in World War II. So I had some exposure there, and it was all very interesting to me because of the context in which I got exposed. You with me?
Yeah, I'm with you, man.
I probably shouldn't go off.
No, you're fine.
Too much. We got a lot of material to cover here, so.
Sure. Well, the thing is, the reason I say that is because I think if there was people out there with this knowledge, and I know it's the level that we're talking about, Gerald, and they could find Gilgamesh's body, and they had a location for it. I mean, there's evidence to say that they pulled out after they found the body of Gilgamesh. There's a BBC article talking about this, that the war ended as soon as they had the body of Gilgamesh. They brought it was in 2003 that they actually got the body, and using Gilgamesh's writings about the orientation of his city, and after the Germans, and this is where the Germans started coming. They came, Saddam Hussein brought the magnetometer team in to map out the city of Uruk, Gilgamesh's city, to find his grave, and they found it. And a press release was given in 2003 that they found it. But apparently,
then it was exactly where the Tigris and Euphrates met, where he described, so.
And apparently there was also a special technology developed, I think, that there's a certain ferrous compound in the body. It's a very, very weak ferrous compound, long chemical formula, and it shows up in biological matter. And
that's interesting.
And they brought this special, it had only been developed the year before, Gerald. I think it's got ferrous, some sort of FeSO4, I can't remember, it's some long chemical formula. And when you put this special magnetometer over it, this special one that picks up only this biological ferrous compound, they're able to they can tell you if there's a body on the ground or not.
Sure. Sure. I'll bet you the technology has gotten to the place now where you can practically do it from a satellite.
I mean, we know that Gilgamesh was like a demigod. This guy was half.
Well, yeah. Well, let's talk about that real quick. And so answering this issue for Zecharia Sitchin, who was seeking to find some genetic proof of this. We know that Gilgamesh would be a good example because his mother was a full-blown Anunnaki goddess, and she was described as being Min-sun, and a very important being, okay? And that means that if his mother was a female, that means the mitochondrial DNA from her got contributed to his DNA. So it's very important. Okay? And that's probably why he was a king, because he was in the lineage of his father and his half-sister that got him there. Well, turns out his father was Lugalbanda.
If you wanted to grab some Anunnaki DNA, Gerald, that was the best chance, the best.
Yeah, well, I've mentioned that one a couple of times. Hey, you found his grave, blah, blah, blah. It looks like we can go get the DNA out of the bones of a Denisovian that's 400,000 years old. How about one that's 2,900 years old, right there in the grave of Gilgamesh? And so, his father, not being an Anunnaki, but he was a primitive worker like us. Well, that was a very telling case in checking that his DNA was 2/3, Anunnaki, and you could see it's a perfect example of having both of our DNA, our primitive DNA that was done to us by Enki and Ningshita as a subset of theirs, mixed with, one of these high-ranking Anunnakis who had the pure blood. And this turns out to be a big issue, in that how pure your DNA is relative to the maternal source of the Anunnaki, the sacred feminine, and the extent to which you age. So if you had pure bloodline, it looks like you had the capabilities in your DNA to overcome the shortening of the telomeres, or if they had to have an elixir, on this planet, which looks like they did, which was monoatomic gold, to supplant that. But in general, I think by design, these beings had telomeres that didn't decay, and they could live very, very long times in a single body. And with their knowledge of the electromagnetic spectrum, if something happened to that body, they could easily replace it with another one and transfer their consciousness into it. So the idea of an avatar comes up even early in the first tablet of the Atrahasis, where Enki creates the first avatar, who was the Adapa. So we're all avatars when you come to realize that.
Yeah. I remember going through that whole 2012 thing and even before that and the build up towards it, and people were going on about this DNA activation and all. I used to think there, and naively, I just go, oh, it's all a very new agey, whatever, and I wouldn't give it any consideration. But when you give me what we're talking about now, Gerald, and you give me written accounts and Sumerian history, it just makes sense to me. If it was told...
Now combine that with the Mayan calendar, the Zolkin calendar in particular, which was their slow unfolding of the evolution of consciousness.
The Mayan,
you'll see that we went from galactic consciousness in the 8th level to universal consciousness in the 9th. That means probably that the energy level that's interacting with your human antenna, your meat modem, is at its highest state, and that's the time at the highest level of consciousness that the Anunnaki, in my opinion, would probably then finally disclose to their primitive workers that, yeah, we created you, and you've gone through this long process of awakening through these cycles, and now you're here, and you're one of us and we're one of you, and that's what it is. The reality is, I believe that is the case.
There are
we have become the Anunnaki through our DNA, and that's how we were programmed.
There are few people on this planet that would argue, Gerald, that we went through an energy, enlightenment, an awareness, an awakening, going through that dark rift. There's very few people. I mean, regardless of what level you were at on that awareness scale, everybody will say that, there's an awakening on this planet, to at least some level. Hopefully it's going to keep going, and hopefully it's going to evolve a bit quicker, and we get some good positive results out of it. Because I'm all into this.
Well, that's the real question. Is the 100 monkey theorem going to be enough to overcome the beatdown that the New World Order is doing to try and take over the whole planet, put people back into a primitive worker consciousness, and have them be their slaves again, right? Well, there's forces here that don't want that to happen, and we get into that in the book later.
Sure.
And there is a war between light and dark going on, and it is representational of the high-level council members that were introduced to us in the last book, the Anunnaki Nibiru, which I put in the God table.
It's a complex.
And those are very, very real beings. This myth, and when you look at the symbols and systems that are in place to make their will happen, you'll realize Light and dark are coming head to head again, and they're representative of these two clans, the Enkyites and the Enlilites. Not to be too Hatfield and McCoyish, because some of them cross the boundaries between the family lines, some intermarried. But just as a simple a construct to talk about them. Mm-hmm. In general, there was a set of them, like you said, that were benevolent toward mankind, but there was a set of them that had the attributes of, a genocidal murderer that had no problem, like a serial killer, just wiping people out. No consciousness, no empathy. Mm-hmm. And we see that on this planet now with the barbaristic acts of some beings. It's man's inhumanity to man seems to know no limits if it's under the guises of this energy that's controlling the human antenna when it's unconscious or down at its root chakra level. It's barbaristic.
I spoke to Steve Bassett from the Disclosure Network, Paradigm Research Group last week there, and he was telling me that I agree to a certain level. He was saying that look at the human spectrum on the planet as we are right now. You have at one end of the scale, psychopathic, serial killers, brutal, vicious monsters, that would just, do stuff for pure fun. And then you have at the other end of the scale, these savant type, intellectual, creative people. We have everything in between. We have this.
Yeah. Serial killers to saints. Yep.
Serial killers to saints. Yeah. Everything in between. And, and he was saying that, if these, extraterrestrial phenomenon, is coming to this planet, that they're going to want to talk to the intellectuals at one end and not the others. And I'm, well, that kind of depends. I don't know. I don't know if we have identified the extraterrestrial phenomenon and what he was speaking of. I think, where we are on this evolutionary scale, I still think we're back in terms of where the Anunnaki original beginnings were. We had psychopaths.
I agree with you. Listen, they had personality traits that range from serial killer to saint, and we wonder where we got that. Well, they were free will beings to choose their own destiny just like we are. They were on their evolutionary path too, back to the light. And the reality was, not all of them were evolving at the same rate. So, you had some that were, I don't know, almost operating like they were in a penal colony. The idea of bringing 50 workers for you, that whether they were doing it willingly or they were ordered to because they were being sent on exile to here for some bad thing they did on their planet. We don't know that for sure. But look what happened in Australia. I mean, the whole island was set up by a penal colony that was the bad seed that was exported out of the UK. They didn't want them there. They sent them down to Australia and look, so that idea is not foreign.
Well, I did a show, Gerald, very early on in Capricorn Radio's earliest days with Shannon Doherty, and, wonderful author. There's not very many authors that talk about the Dogon, but the Dogon's origins talk about these, semi-aquatic reptilian fish gods, called the Nummo. And apparently the Nummo were aware of the Anunnaki. Now, this is from her accounts, and this is on hearsay from her book, or her accounts or her research, but apparently that the Nummo were aware of the Anunnaki, and that the Anunnaki would have wiped out the Nummo if they could have, but the Nummo were so far advanced than the Anunnaki, they just tolerated them. They weren't, they were empathetic, and they weren't psychopathic or, genocidal, and they just said, just because you want to kill us doesn't mean we want to kill you. You haven't got that in your power anyway. So, it's funny. And they said that they were actually, here as a penal colony, they were on the run, basically.
I'll tell you a little story about the Dogon when I was digging into it. I found very, very, very interesting. First of all, I was back kind of on a mission working with some people in Arkansas. We were doing some structural integration work with a group of people back there, and I won't name any names or anything. But anyway, one of their people that was part of this church that was back there was a missionary in Mali. Mm-hmm. And he had lots of pictures that he shared. He had recently been over there and visited this, he was a healer that was there, and he was working with their tribe to help them. And, there was a lot of stuff going on. There started to be an incursion from from Islam that was overtaking the area. So they were starting to end up in some real heated problems. And now you look what's going on in Mali now. Ebola's there and Boko Haram is there. It's like, oh my gosh. So anyway, there was something that came out of that though. I'd been researching the Mali and reading about their understanding about how they came to their knowledge of Sirius B, the star Sirius B, which they clearly affiliated with. And, you know, a lot of modern researchers go, well, we knew about Sirius A, you can see that, but how did they know about Sirius B? And also, how did they know about the spiral pattern that the two binary stars made around each other? And it turns out they had some wand, it looked like a staff with a strange angular head on it, that when you oriented it in a certain orientation and rotated it, it mapped exactly the binary star pattern of Sirius A and B. So where did they get that? You know, so there's some really interesting things about the Dogon. And they clearly had an ancient alien encounter at some point in their cargo cult.
Sure.
And they're still perpetuating that, hiding certain things in caves that represent these beings that they had encounters with.
They also have...
it's guarded 24/7 by one of their elders. It's amazing.
Yeah. Sirius C as well, Gerald. It wasn't just Sirius B. Sirius B and A is the main ones, but they were able to say about Sirius C because it's actually another one as well. And it's a triple star system.
Wow, I wasn't aware of that.
Yeah,
one.
most people
Sirius B was as far as I got. I was like, wow, you know.
Yeah, well, that's because that one it says it all anyway. The other one's just a little bit for posterity, but Sirius
A
and
idea
B.
that you bring up is that there could have been multiple alien species on this planet and visiting this planet, causing all kinds of different cargo cults. And according to, like I said, from somebody who was in the know, Paul Hellyer, who was exposed to this stuff, he said there were definitely 4 species and then up to 20 of them on the planet. Well, They've been here for thousands of years. So, you know, we shouldn't be surprised.
Yeah. Gerald, we're going to take a quick break there. I'll be back in just a moment. But before we do, please give us out your website where people can find you, what you do, check your blog for updates and social media.
Okay. You can reach, the best way to get me is to go to my website, and that's GeraldClark77.com. GeraldClark 77.com. And from there, I've got links to my other media outlets, whether it's YouTube or Facebook or whatever. But I am starting to do more of my focused, interactions with deep seekers on my blog. So, you know, I'm probably going to be moderating a little bit more and not tolerating so much ankle biting and stuff, because that's the area where I want people that are really on the inside. Not that I'm asking them to drink the Kool-Aid, but that's where I'm going to be spending more of my time disclosing some of the more engineering oriented stuff, you know, models and drawings and connections and things like that. So, and a lot of that may not be appropriate for higher level communication. So I'm kind of restricting that a little bit, just so you know. So, GeraldClark77.com.
For sure. Okay, we're going to take a quick break there. There's those 7s again, Gerald.
Well, we might end up talking a little bit about numerology later, so.
We'll do that after the break.
We promised in the last show we'd talk about what the significance of number 33 was, and I hope we get at least a minute to talk about that.
We will. Okay, Gerald, back in just a moment.
Okay, great.
Hi, everybody, and welcome back to Capricorn Radio. This is your host, James, and I'm delighted to be in the second half of the show, getting into the nit and gritty of the Anunnaki origins in the beginning. And it's just so fascinating. I was just talking to Gerald on the break, and how the penny has dropped even on the show. And I keep having these realizations of in the profound depths of this whole Sumerian tales. First of all, welcome back to the show, Gerald.
Thanks, buddy. It's great to be here.
Yeah, you know, so much to get into another show, Gerald, and I like what we're doing. I like that we're getting into some philosophy, some, you know, tying things together and connecting things, as well as talking about some historical data as well. You need to give the data to philosophize about it, and I like the mix that we're doing here. There's a few things I want to mention, Gerald. I mean, I just briefly, you know, we talk about Nibiru, or Nibiru as people call it. I want to just mention, just throw this one in, the IRAS satellite data. And this is just for the naysayers out there, Gerald. Nobody talks about this. How did this stuff get swept under the carpet, this IRAS satellite, stuff? Let's talk about this.
Yeah, it's a good question. You know, I'm actually very surprised that the video I had up for a very long time documenting that Zecharia Sitchin met with Dr. Harrington to discuss this concept of a planet out at the edge of our solar system could have possibly caused the perturbations of the orbital plane of Neptune and Uranus, and Pluto as well, but mostly those bigger planets, because it had to be something quite large to affect a large planet's ecliptic relative to the sun and its orbit. So it put it on an inclined plane. And, you know, so the idea that this was the focal point of our astrologers and scientists to try to understand what happened out there such that these planets were not on the same orbital plane with the solar ecliptic, that something had to have caused it. So Dr. Harrington was aware of that, and it was not a new problem to scientists. Lots of them were trying to come up with theories of what happened out there. So the idea that he invited Sitchin to come and explain his theory that he had, and it wasn't even really his theory, it was his interpretation of the Babylonian epic of creation, the Enuma Elish. And apparently Harrington had read it as well, and realized that whatever happened there was clearly seminal, and that it warranted developing a satellite or a probe like the infrared astronomical scope satellite to try and find out what was going on out there. So he was very much a part of commissioning that research. And so when he met with Sitchin and they talked about the Enuma Elish and whether it was telling the correct story, the bottom line is Harrington agreed that it was. And the only difference he felt in his mind relative to the pattern or the pathway that had been drawn in the elliptical orbit for Nibiru by Sitchin was that it hadn't fully taken into account the precession of the equinox, but it was the same exact pattern, just showed up in a different zodiacal house as it came into the close perihelion with the sun. So those two walked away in complete agreement, and it was documented on video. And it came out in, 3 to 5 different newspaper articles, starting from the time that Sitchin wrote his book until I think it was the mid 80s, and then later, even in the 90s, there was another group of people that looked at this again and said, based on all the evidence, Pioneer 10, 11, and all the IRS data, it's clear there is a 10th planet in our solar system. Call it Planet X, which the X in Roman numerals represented 10. And in the scientific realm, X oftentimes is used as a variable that could take on other names, right? Sure. It was appropriately named when they called it Planet X.
So. Do you think, Gerald, perhaps it's some people call it the Nibiru system, that it's like a red dwarf, brown dwarf type sun with planets orbiting around it. So on some of the orbiting planets of the red brown dwarf, maybe closer to it, getting enough heat, just enough light that they're able to survive on the planet. Obviously, you're not going to survive on a brown dwarf. It's like a miniature little system in itself, Gerald.
Well, yeah. If you look at the Babylonian epic of creation in Enuma Elish, this is over 11 tablets of very complicated planetary interactions. They painted it as I guess they painted it as a celestial battle, an allegory to a celestial battle. These billiard ball planets running into each other. Now, imagine your planet. And I have a theory. I've never discussed this with anyone before, but I'll tell you right now. We just went through what I believe, and I think we're still going through the galactic center. I think it takes some time to go.
20 years, maybe, Gerald.
Minimally, I think it takes 3.5 years. Because the 3.5 comes up in Revelations and other places about this 1,260 days when the two witnesses kind of thing. Well, if you tie this back into the timing with what Dr. Kellerman pointed out, it didn't actually happen on December 21st, 2012, even though that's what we were guided to believe. It actually happened in October 28th, 2011. So I think, add 3.5 years to that, you could see that we could, if that's true, we could be coming to kind of an apex of the height of consciousness, to the point where they understood when you left the dark rift that then human consciousness started going to sleep. Which, from an energy standpoint, knowing about these latent circuits, the amount of radiation and energy that's in the flattened nebula that surrounds the black hole, the center of our galaxy. It's a massive amount of energy. So much gravitational increase and effect on photons that they're being sucked into the threshold of the black hole and being recycled. Even light. So the idea that our solar system is wobbling through the galactic center, well, that appears to be what established this 26,000 year cycle that the Anunnaki used to tell time on our planet. Well, it's kind of a crazy thing. So I think we're going through that right now, and and when we leave it, you know, there's going to be problems. I lost my train of thought where I was going to try and take you with that. But there was something there about the Mayans, the dark rift, and consciousness.
Mm. Oh, the Mayans, anyway. To come back to the Mayans, Gerald, I mean, these guys were so sophisticated in their astronomy. I mean, they had the solar year to 4 decimal places, Gerald. I mean, more accurate.
Oh, well, exactly. Well, when you realize the accuracy that they had, and now you realize it came from Ningshita, this premier scientist, you start to, you know, give a lot more credence to this guy. He was absolutely the quintessential of what we would term brilliant. I mean, just brilliant in all aspects. Because their calendar is fascinating, really fascinating.
I love the Mayan cosmology. It is a very, very advanced, sophisticated work of body of knowledge, Gerald. It's a body of knowledge. To think that only a few of those books survived, Gerald.
Yeah, that was a whole story in Dresden when at the end of World War II, when you know the war was over, and I wouldn't have known this had I not been traveling back and forth to Dresden, Germany, where our factory was for LightPoint. We had our manufacturing facility there, and then I've come to find out that, you know, I'm right next to the headquarters of the Saxony Kings and the Frauenkirche that was bombed, and they were still putting it back together piece by piece like a jigsaw puzzle, like Legos when I was there. And actually in 2002, they were just putting the capstone back onto that church, from when it was bombed after World War II. Now, I wanted to talk about that in relation to the Mayan Codex. It was a very interesting story. And that apparently some of the early German researchers had gone to the Yucatan and gotten some of these codices from the Mayan to try and decode the language. And one of them ended up in the museum there in the Saxony Kings in Dresden, in that area, in the museum. And at the end of World War II, when I guess the decision was made to teach the Germans a lesson and go hit them at their cultural capital and make, you know, just to let them know that we're the boss and that you're going to surrender unconditionally, whatever it was that made them go do this heinous act. They went in and after the war was over and completely sacked the city of Dresden, its cultural capital, including the museum where this Mayan Codex was hidden away. Well, apparently, from the story, the museum was destroyed. All its contents were all over the ground. And some soldier apparently was walking through this rubble and looked at a strange-looking book, happened to pick it up, and it turned out to be one of the Mayan codices that survived.
Wow.
That's crazy, isn't it?
Wow.
That's just crazy. So, anyway, so the idea of energy, timing of galactic wobble. Oh, where I was leading, I remember now. Now, think about Nibiru as an invader planet. Clearly Sitchin thought it was, and so did, Harrington after he described this in this video. And I put it back up on my website, Gerald Clark 7700 Media. I got that video still up. Now, it belongs to somebody else, but I'm sharing it, okay? But it's been up for a while, and I don't know how much longer it's going to be up, because, there are forces out there that don't want the truth out, and everybody ought to be aware of that by now. So, but what I was going to tell you was, at some point in their cosmogony, in the Enuma Elish, their planet ended up going through some process where it then got trapped into our solar system. Well, my theory is that when you go through the galactic center, there's a lot of reshuffling of the billiard balls because of this variation in the gravity field, external energy, probably because of that, a rotating body that would strike that would experience a gradient field that could cause possibly changes in its polar orbit. So if it's rotating about an axis and it strikes something, think about a helicopter. Any rotating body that has an input force on it will experience a concept called let's see, what's it called? Gyroscopic precession. So if you input a force on a rotating body, it'll manifest 90 degrees in the direction of rotation. Well, imagine a rotating body like a planet striking the gradient field of the dark rift as it's oscillating through this wobbling black hole. So the black hole itself at the center of our galaxy is causing the wobble. So it's wobbling, which means all the planets that are being drug around in its nebula, spinning around, are also wobbling up and back through the center of this Milky Way galaxy ecliptic, okay? So we experience that every about 13,000 years, and actually it turns out to be 25,920 years to go all the way around, where you've wobbled up, created a complete sinusoidal wobble, okay? So I believe that's exactly what Ningshita was aware of when he was back in Africa programming our DNA. How many times had they seen this before?
Ace up the sleeve, Gerald. That was new.
And they knew the energetic effect on through the electromagnetic spectrum, and I think he programmed us with this 9 rows of the Sulcan calendar, now that you realize it was him, to expose you to the idea of how, as you get closer to this galactic center and the source of this energy that wakes us up to the highest consciousness, he did it in stages, starting all the way back to the creation of time on this planet, and then started telescoping by a decrementing scale of 20 with 13 columns, 7 days of creation, and 7 nights of destruction, and they alternate. So there's that magic number 13 in the columns, right?
Sure.
And then going up in the rows, he started out at the very cellular level and walked the consciousness level all the way up to where we are now, which is at the universal consciousness. Now, what I'm positing here is that disturbance that happened at that galactic center, I believe that is the defining event that probably disturbed Nibiru's orbit, caused all this galactic allegory of the planetary battle that shows up in the Enuma Elish. And I believe that's the place where they ended up trapped in our solar system's orbit. And it is pretty clear when they tell it from their standpoint that it looks like that's what happened. And on the first go around, they didn't have a collision. Some of their planets around, or their satellites, if you will, or their stars, or their moons of Nibiru, apparently did have collisions. In the first in the Enuma Elish, for instance, one of their initially, for the first pass through perihelion, once they got trapped, they described this. They had one of their satellites strike an object, which they knew was going to cause a problem for them. And as a matter of fact, this is where Mumu comes up, because the very first thing they talk about is the relationship between Mercury and the sun and what was going to happen when they went into close perihelion. That's very telling, okay?
Awesome.
Well, the second time around, they described their planet actually striking Tiamat. And Tiamat was in the place of where the Earth was prior to this happening. And I go through this decoding the Enuma Elish for people and try to do the blow by blow like they told it.
Yeah.
But I also then back up and retell it with a higher level meta awareness, like you would tell a story without being blow by blow, like a sportscaster.
Sure.
But so I did that in the first book, and the second one I even refined it even more. But this idea that their planet struck Tiamat, broke it in pieces. Part of it became the Earth. Part of it became Kingu, our moon. Has been our scientists have been sneaking up on understanding that since science began on this planet. At least for our primitive workers, as it was disclosed to them, to understand what happened. And we're just now getting sophisticated enough to understand the Enuma Elish.
Well, I just wanted to mention that because a lot of people have purported this new Nibiru story as the main body of evidence, and I wanted to get some of that IRAS satellite background in there. And this is a factual reality. We're not just talking some Sumerian accounts. There's modern day stuff going on, verifying ancient stuff, and that's for other people to do. Yeah. That's for other people to do the extra research if they want. And
so what that brings up is the question of when is Nibiru coming? Because it looks like clearly, periodically, if it comes through like they said, there'll be gravitational impact effects. The Earth's going to get perturbed, and blah blah blah. And I think that clearly does happen. It doesn't happen every time. It depends on where the Earth is relative to Nibiru when it comes through the planet as the crossing point, right? Mm-hmm. That's the most important point. So,
that's incredibly hard to predict, though, Gerald.
It is. And then also, when you have a long elliptical orbit for a planet, guess what? It's not like clockwork. It could be off plus or minus, according to how far that one is, plus or minus 50 years.
Yeah.
So it's not, okay, it's going to be here on the winter solstice of this date. It's going to cross through. Well, you can expect that, but I would proffer to you that that's why the Lucifer scope went up on Mount Graham, is to keep track of when that planet is actually coming through. Now, from the Earth changes we're seeing, I do believe that this galactic transit, the dark rift transit of our planet, is definitely causing perturbations. And even the founder of the Weather Channel admits, and is a big, strong proponent of the fact that mankind is not causing this. This is a galactic wobble issue. We're facing forces that are affecting our adjacent planets as well. So the idea that, because we're putting carbon-based fuels in our SUV and that we're all responsible for this so that we can be taxed for breathing. Al Gore, you can kiss my butt. You are a moron. Okay, I'm going to say it over the air. And you have no business being in the weather business, so get out.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? Now, that said, we are experiencing massive changes. And according to Einstein, even in Charles Hapgood's book that was written in the 50s.
Oh, yeah.
He wrote the opening to that book, discussing the potential of our plate tectonic skins taking a wild ride if the orbital velocity or angular momentum of the planet Earth was changed by anything suddenly. So imagine you got a spinning gyroscope and you change its, or introduce a wobble suddenly just by something passing that has a gravitational impact for it, or magnetic or electromagnetic. Either way, all the fields are related that way. And so there's oftentimes, if you have an airplane flying through the air, it creates parasitic drag that the electrostatic charge needs to be dissipated before you touch it. So they have electrostatic dischargers on the end of the wings to discharge that electricity because you're gathering this as you fly through the air. Now think about a big planet that's been doing this, comes close to another planet. It's like, okay, there's a difference in charge here. It's like a battery. They're going to try to equalize. So you could have a large arcing effect of electricity from one to the other that potentially explains some of the stuff we see on the surface of Mars.
The electrical scarring.
Yeah, so the idea that what Einstein described as a sudden, almost like a skin on an orange that could suddenly shift when the rotating body stops, and the outside skin would continue rotating with the body while the core, it does something quite different. Well, if that happened on a planet that was composed mostly of water, like the Earth, imagine the size of tidal waves you could produce going over the land that happened. I'm talking, thousands of feet high,
mile high.
Not a little shore incursion like we saw in Indonesia, even though it was terrible, up to, maybe even 100 feet high. But we're talking a mile high or more. I mean, that's incredible to think about if you suddenly stop the orientation or wobble of the Earth. Well, similarly, another problem that could occur is you generally on a planet like ours, because of how the sun strikes the surface and it's spinning, the poles get really cold and you build up ice caps. Well, now introduce a wobble, and this ice has a very different density than air or even water. So now all of a sudden you got something with significant density and it's sitting on the poles where the orientation axis and the angular momentum tries to seek the middle, just like an ice skater that brings their arms in, right? They start spinning faster around their line. Well, this ice built up on the poles actually slows the ice skater from spinning at a certain rate. Well, all of a sudden, if it breaks off because of a sudden wobble, it's going to head toward the equator, right where the loose objects, the plate tectonic skins can go. And all of a sudden, what's that going to do to imagine a ball going around, and all the weight ends up around the midline like a hula hoop. Now all of a sudden you got this lump going around and it could cause some sort of resonance that's even worse than what was before. You see what I'm saying? So it will cause a chain reaction of things that will try to get back to homeostasis on this spherical body that was rotating at balance at some point. So, the idea of pole shifts and all these other problems happening because of a passing planet or as you're going through the galactic center. In and of itself, imagine where you are relative to your sun and the energy it's producing. Mm-hmm. So if you're on the windward side, not the leeward side of the sun, relative to the galactic center, that sun could be putting off CMEs and stuff that normally might be projected out and away from your planet. But all of a sudden now, because of the focusing energy of the dark rift that's pulling it toward the galactic center, and you're right in the way, you might get a focused blast of energy and completely torch the surface of your Earth. So that's possible too.
Wow.
So just because the Nibiru's going by, you could have changes, but going through the dark rift is a serious business.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It's serious. So if you didn't have an atmosphere, you wouldn't survive it. It's that serious.
Such a complex playground of research that even the Sumerian tales can lead you into the processional knowledge. And I mean, these guys, the Sumerians, these guys didn't just have what they left us; they had their own stuff too, their own knowledge. I mean, these guys were so advanced, and we have remnants of that.
Speaking of that, you bring up a funny story that I told in the first book that I'd almost forgotten. Now I'm re-recording the audiobook for my first book now that I've learned a little bit more about how to make a little better quality. You know, I didn't get a lot of complaints, and I kept the price of the first book very, very low. I just wanted the information out there. But in that process, I was re-recording it, and I ran into some stuff that was pretty funny. And one of them was, I don't know, I've got a little bit of a sense of humor, and it showed up my second book. But part of it was Zog the Caveman. I don't know if anybody's ever seen the claymation accounts where this alien comes into an encounter with these barbarians living in caves and is trying to disseminate knowledge to them. And it's on YouTube. You can go look at some of these, but absolutely funny. Wow. And I was going somewhere with that, but I forgot where it was. But this dissemination of knowledge to these primitive workers relative to this ancient race it's really hard on your head. It's funny though when you back up and look at it.
Gerald, I got little time left, and I want to save some time for the Lamentations of Ur. But before I get there, I want to talk about the Sumerian kingship and how it revolves. You can throw in, you know, the Sumerian kings' ages if you like, and maybe just explain the kingship.
Okay.
The kingship, how it revolves, and why this ties in with the Lamentations of Ur.
Okay. Well, there was something interesting that I noticed when I was going through the Sumerian kings. First of all, I was trying to add up the time to see if this list given to us by Berossus could definitively state when they arrived. They said they came 450,000 years ago. And then if you look at the Sumerian kings list and you work it out, depending on which one you look at, the one that Berossus gave us actually goes back 420,000 years. Okay, so they're different pieces. So I tried to just focus on the ones that we had definitive knowledge on, okay? But the first 8 rulers before the big flood in the first part of the Sumerian kings list is very seminal because it looks like they all served complete shars, and their rulerships were listed in shar. They weren't broken up, and all the way through until you got to the last one. So it's like 176,500 years for the first 8 kings. And they moved the city from Ridu, where the first king was. Alulim was the king there. And it ended up in Sharupak at the end, because that's in Genesis 6 or so. You realize that's when the flood came for Noah. Actually, it was later in Genesis. But the flood came, and that was in Sharupak. Okay, so all of a sudden you got a Sumerian kings list that ties back with the Bible, and exactly the same time frame, 600 years after he was king. Okay, well that goes back to the Atrahasis. So that was all very interesting to me. So then you go from the first Sumerian kings list, flood happens, and you pick up the kings list in Mesopotamia. And you start looking at the list and go, well, how long did they serve relative to these other ones? All of a sudden, you see these reigns of the kings is getting shorter and shorter. I mean, down to really short, like now to us it's a long time, but when you look at the longest kings that were serving on the Sumerian kings list, the last one at Bad Tabira in the first 8 rulers, he served 12 shars. That's 12 times 3,600 years. Okay. The very first one served 8 shars, which was 28,800 years. So the one at Bad Tabira, right before it ended up in Sharupak under, Atrahasis, who was Zeusudra, he served for 12 shars. Okay. So if a shar was 4,000 years, that would be 48,000 years. So it's just short of 45,000 years he served. That's not how long he lived. That's how long he served. Now, so keep that in mind. Now jump to the Sumerian kings list that starts after the flood. Now you realize Enki is now gone down to Africa. The Mesopotamian region now belongs to Enlil. The Sinai is under Nanar-Sin, and the Indus Valley belongs to Inanna, or Hathor. Okay. So all of a sudden, you start seeing this merry-go-round of the kings that's going from city to city to city to city. And the reason the kingship moved was very telling too. It was like, and the king, and let's focus on just one for now. And there are lots of lamentations, okay? Mm-hmm. Well, these lamentation documents came up that were crying out about the destruction of their kingship and why it moved from city to city, okay? So this was very interesting to me, because in the king's list, the Sumerian king's list, you get a one-liner, and the kingship was defeated and was moved to this city. And I'm like, wow, you mean there was a battle and they were fighting? Who were they fighting? You know, there's just no detail at all. Well, then you go to these Lamentations, and this is where the detail is. This is where you find out what these kings were saying about what happened to them before it got moved like a merry-go-round from here to here to here. Okay, so as an intro to that, the other reason I chose this particular one, it happened in the Sumerian city of Ur. Remember who was from the city of Ur? This was where Abram came from. His father Terah was working in this temple, serving this being that we're just about to talk about. Okay? Now, understand that Ur was the capital of Sumer twice. And there were other capitals there. I think Uruk was there once, and several, it moved around a lot, and you'll see it in the King's List, okay? So, the idea that we're in the place where God told Abram to leave his city and go take the land of Canaan is very seminal. I chose it for this reason. Now you're going to find out who the beings are in the city, what their relationships are, and why this kingship jumped all over the place. Mm-hmm. Okay? Keep in mind the spirit of these beings that we're talking about, because it goes all the way back to the Atrahasis. And that's the other thing I want to mention to you. In the Atrahasis, one of those beings led the Ajiji miners in a revolt. Okay? And his name, according to the account, was Allah. Okay? Well, we come to find out in my first book, I clearly identified him as Nanar Sin. Okay? And where did he take the rebellious group that he was leading? Kind of like, in reality, he's a hero. He was standing up to the oppression that these beings were experiencing in the mind and said, this is enough. No, I'm representing their rights, and this is enough. So from that standpoint, he's already showing heroic characteristics in my mind, no matter how he's been portrayed through history. Mm-hmm. Shows up where? At his dad's house, Enlil's house. Okay, so now keep that in mind. Enlil got embarrassed in front of Anu and Enki over this issue with the Atrahasis because of Nanar. Because Allah led these people in a revolt. So keep that in mind when you read this particular lamentation, because it has deep roots in history of why it happened.
Gerald, pause there. I'm going to play an excerpt from the audiobook, Seventh Planet, Mercury Rising. It's the lamentation of Ur, orated by yourself, Gerald. And just going to play that for the listeners so that they can have a taste of what we're actually talking about. And,
actually, it's going to be more than a taste, and hold on to your seats.
And pay particular attention to the sentiment in the original writing. So I'm just going to play that, Gerald, and it's in a short clip.
I'm going to put it on mute, and I'm just going to listen.
For sure, it's a short clip.
You decide after reading the dreadful account for the destruction of the city of Ur. Lamentations for the destruction of Ur. Many lament texts have been found, each mourning the destruction of a different Sumerian city. This one speaks for itself. The goddess of Ur, Ningal, tells how she suffered under her sense of coming doom. When I was grieving for that day of storm destined for me, laid upon me, heavy with tears. That day of storm destined for me, laid upon me, heavy with tears, on me, the queen. Though I was trembling for that day of storm destined for me, I could not flee before that day's fatality. And of a sudden I espied no happy days within my reign, no happy days within my reign. Though I would tremble for that night of cruel weeping destined for me, I could not flee before that night's fatality. Dread of the storm's flood-like destruction weighed on me, and of a sudden upon my couch at night, no dreams were granted me. And of a sudden upon my couch oblivion was not granted, because this bitter anguish had been destined for my land. As the cow to the mired calf, even had I come to help it on the ground, I could not have pulled my people back out of the mire, because this bitter dolour had been destined for my city. Even if I, bird-like, had stretched my wings, and I, like a bird, flown to my city, yet my city would have been destroyed on its foundation, yet Ur would have perished where it lay. Because that day of storm had raised its hand, and even I had screamed out loud and cried, Turn back, O day of storm, turn to thy desert, the breast of that storm would not have been lifted from me. Then verily to the assembly, where the crowd had not yet risen, while the Anunnaki, binding themselves to uphold the decision, were still seated, I dragged my feet, and I stretched out my arms. Truly, I shed my tears in front of On. Truly I mourned in front of Enlil. May my city not be destroyed. I said indeed to them, may Ur not be destroyed. I said indeed to them, and may its people not be killed. I said indeed to them, but On never bent towards these words, and Enlil never with On. It is pleasing, so be it, did soothe my heart. Behold, they gave instruction that the city be destroyed. Behold, they gave instruction that Ur be destroyed, and as its destiny decreed that its inhabitants be killed. Enlil called the storm, the people mourn. Winds of abundance he took from the land, the people mourn. Good winds he took away from Sumer, the people mourn. Deputed evil winds, the people mourn, and trusted them to King Galuda, tender of storms. He called the storm that annihilates the land, the people mourn. He called disastrous winds, the people mourn. Enlil, choosing Gibil as his helper, called the great hurricane of heaven, the people mourn. The blinding hurricane howling across the skies, the people mourn. The tempest, unsubduable like breaks through the levees, beats down upon, devours the city's ships. All these he gathered at the base of heaven. The people mourn. Great fires he lit that heralded the storm. The people mourn, and lit on either flank of furious winds the searing heat of the desert. Like flaming heat of noon this fire scorched. The storm ordered by Enlil in hate, the storm which wears away the country, covered Ur like a cloth, veiled it like a linen sheet. On that day did the storm leave the city. That city was a ruin. I, Father Nana, that town was left a ruin. The people mourn. On that day did the storm leave the country. The people mourn. Its people's corpses, not potsherds, littered the approaches. The walls were gaping, the high gate, the roads were piled with dead. In the wide streets, where feasting crowds once gathered, jumbled they lay. In all the streets and roadways bodies lay. In open fields that used to fill with dancers, the people lay in heaps. The country's blood now filled its holes like metal in a mold. Bodies dissolved like butter left in the sun. Nanar, god of the moon and spouse of Ningal, appeals to his father Enlil. O my father who engendered me, what has my city done to you? Why have you turned away from it? O Enlil, what has my city done to you? Why have you turned away from it? The ship of first fruits no longer brings first fruits to the engendering father. No longer goes in to Enlil in Nippur with your bread and food portions. O my father who engendered me, fold again into your arms my city from its loneliness. O Enlil, fold again in my Ur into your arms from its loneliness. Fold again my temple from Akishungal into your arms from its loneliness. Let renown emerge from you in Ur. Let the people expand for you. Let the ways of Sumer, which have been destroyed, be restored for you. Enlil answered his son Swain, saying, The heart of the wasted city is weeping. Reeds for flutes of lament grow therein. Its heart is weeping. Reeds for flutes of laments grow in. Its people spend the day in weeping. O noble Nana, be thou concerned about yourself. What truck have you with fears? There is no revoking a verdict, a decree of the assembly. A command of On and Enlil is not known ever to have been changed. Ur was verily granted a kingship. A lasting term it was not granted. From days of yore when the country was first settled to where it has proceeded now, who ever saw a term of office completed? Its kingship, its term of office, has been uprooted. It must worry you, my Nana. Do you not worry. Leave your city.
Such a heartfelt, emotional account of a genocidal atrocity, Gerald. I mean, tell me that doesn't touch you in an intellectual way when you read or listen to that. Tell me that doesn't touch you.
Well, it's beyond an intellectual level. I have to tell you, as I was recording that in the audiobook, I had to stop the recording, and you heard the change in my voice. I was in tears after I heard that, realizing the hate that this woman, Ningal, the queen of the city, and really, if you realize how in the account, no discussion is talked about her. I think she died in the city with them. That's what she did. And, what a sorrowful lamentation to then have the father who worked with Anu to allow this. This really brings into question Anu's view of mankind as well. To have a father and son discussing this, and to have his dad tell him, well, I just nuked your city from both sides of the flank. Everybody's dead. Don't worry about it. Just leave. Just walk away like nothing happened. Unbelievable. How do you reconcile the father's relationship to his son when something like that has happened? And I give you that account back in Octahasis where Nanar was the one that led the revolt, and maybe Enlil had it out for him. He was going to destroy him for what he did. I don't know. We don't know for sure.
It really speaks volumes, though, doesn't it? And like you said, it's just...
Well, exactly. And, the volumes it speaks about is the spirit of Enlil. And I want that to be loud and clear, and his relationship to Nanar Sin, who clearly is the moon god, as I depicted in the Atrahasis. It's the very same being. So now all of a sudden you realize that Enlil Yahweh has a son, Nanar Allah, and they've bid two populaces against each other. The Jewish nation and the Palestinians. And you have to ask yourself, is this intentional? Are they dividing and trying to cause the destruction? Or is Nanar truly fighting against his father with all that he has because of this bad relationship? And I'm kind of leaning toward the second one, to be honest.
Yeah.
I wasn't sure before, but after reading this and realizing that how his father treated him, it's pretty damning. And Nanar, from all that I've seen his operations through before the writings ended up in the Quran, whether they're real or not. Listen, Nanar was standing up to evil, and that's to be noted here. Truly,
I think
evil of oppression in the minds, and also the evil of the people of the decree that was sent against his city.
I think that's the thing that it speaks volumes about too, that there is this good or evil, or well, maybe good or bad, or good and evil element or internal workings of the Anunnaki hierarchy, that this keeps changing role all the time, or...
Well, I've talked about this a few times and put this model in front of people that, clearly they had a term limit that seemed to be tied to the zodiacal house, and they fought over it at points. Marduk got exiled for asserting himself 2 years too early to take his rulership. And, so the idea of affiliating their names with zodiacal houses should be pretty clear. As a matter of fact, in the Enuma Elish, which surprised me, Enki affiliated himself with the house of Pisces, and Enlil associated with the house of Taurus. So the idea of the bull actually is related to Enlil, which is interesting.
Wow.
But the idea that the zodiacal house was being used to, if it was an equivalence model, that every house with a 30-degree segment is 2,160 years. So that essentially, every 2,160 years, you possibly could see changes in the Anunnaki Council, and possibly there's a power-sharing mechanism where it goes from a clan of the Enkyites to a clan of the Enlilites, and that seemed to be what happened, okay? So the idea that they were vying for this position at the end of a zodiacal house was quite telling. And the way that rulership was implemented based on which clan it came from kind of impacted mankind in a big way in terms of whether they were treated as slaves or they were treated as evolving beings that at some point were going to become fellow Anunnaki. So if it was an Enkyiite in the position, they were probably being treated in the latter respect. Whereas if it was an Enlilite in the seat, you'd kind of see what you've been seeing. So the idea that the house of Pisces was related to Enki, you'd think, well, how come over the age of Pisces we didn't see this benevolence from Enki? Well, if you go back, and we're going to get there eventually, they didn't seem to follow strict rules about honoring other people's rulership, even though the zodiacal house might have specified that. So there was a lot of infighting at the change of the zodiacal house, and it just so happens, I think we're seeing exactly that right now as the command is changing. And we were told about this, and now you realize that the Mayan calendar was a timekeeping mechanism to point to this event. So we're seeing that right now. We're at the height of consciousness. We're becoming aware of our enslavement. The holographic state of our reality is starting to be understood from string theory and quantum theory, and also from the disclosure from Thoth himself. So if you've got this advanced scientist that's disclosing the state of our reality in some document, now that you know who he is, you got to pay real close attention to it. And I did, and you'll see that. It comes out in chapter 5. We'll get there eventually, but just very, very seminal.
Yeah. It's the shifting dynamics over long periods, these epochs of the zodiacal house, 2160 years. It's speaking large time frames. Again, it just reverberates the large time frame system in place.
Yeah. Well, the Hindus had ideas of these long cycles that show up in the Mahabharata and from the Bhagavad Gita, where you had the Kali Yuga cycle and the Satya Yuga cycle, which I think we're in right now. And they had them related to different wobbles. One of them was much longer than 25,920 years. So it's like pretty crazy that they had this knowledge. Well, I'll tie a little something together for you. In the Sumerian accounts, Inanna, got some of the civilization tablets from Enki, who held the tablets of destinies, and went off to the Indus Valley civilization. And so I think the idea of yoga, the energy body, and all that stuff that showed up, in the Indus Valley, actually came from her disclosure from these ME tablets. And, you know, on her, speaking of that, even though she took them without, you know, permission, and then Enki dispatched someone to go get them back and the whole thing, the reality is that disclosure has really helped mankind a lot. You know, with our alternative models of the energy body and quantized consciousness and, you know, all these things from a scientific standpoint, you can look at them and actually they're measurable parameters that showed up in my equation 5a, you know, so from that standpoint, it was interesting how it worked together to weave together in this whole disclosure.
For sure. Gerald, we're out of time. Please give out your website one more time, please, before we wrap up.
Okay. GeraldClark77.com. I've had a little bit of a change on my website and my YouTube channel recently, but if you go to my website, it'll redirect you to the latest data. And I just want to say I'm so excited about having this level of dialogue with a fellow seeker that's coming out the way I intended when I first picked up the microphone and decided I wanted to share my message. So kudos to you, James. I fully support what you're doing, and I hope you become the biggest radio portal on the planet that's telling the truth, because I think next time we're going to talk about where the truth is happening and some other really seminal things in the simulator. So thank you so much for taking the time with me. I know we're 9 or so hours different, and the fact that you're willing to do this at all out hours of the day and night in order to make this happen, I really appreciate that from you.
For sure. Well, you know, a lot of the people don't realize I'm coming at the show from the UK and Ireland, and you know, I do have to get up at 3 a.m. sometimes for shows. It's crazy hours I keep, but I do it because I like it, Gerald, and I do it because there's information and knowledge that's pertinent to me and my truth seeking as well. Gerald, we're out of time again. We've been talking about the 7th planet Mercury rising. Get yourself a copy of this book. It's got so much in there. If you want to know about your origins, if you want to know about where you're going now, on this evolutionary scale, you can get a copy of this book and find out. You listen to your host, James Swagger. Oceans of love and positivity to all my brothers and sisters on this planet, and I'll catch you on the next episode.
Thanks again.